us wanting to remove influence from Ukraine is not necessarily pro-Russian, but what is pro-Russian is when we say that Russia obviously would have wanted to invade because there's so many ethnic Russians in Crimea. That's something that is basically, I'm not saying that you're like a Russian propagandist or whatever, but this is something that is directly beamed down from the Kremlin, and whenever you see like paid Russian state actors, these are the same talking points that they give. Is that my stomach is fucked.
Wait, did I send it to you?
Send what to me?
Co-host?
Maybe. I don't know. I think Joe and his friend need access again. I don't know if it's...
Oh, okay. Okay, there we go. Hello?
Hello?
Hello.
I think they got accepted.
Am I
Yeah,
there?
sorry. Twitter. Yeah.
Cool. All right, I invited my good friend Mr. Lead over here. I don't know if you requested to speak or not, but we always have.
Yeah, I just wrote them right here. There you
Huh? How's it going? New person? Nice to meet you.
So heads up, I'm the moderator. My friend here's the main guy that's speaking. So just Remy, or how do I say your name?
Rinyald. I need to change.
Rinyald.
I need to change my display name because it's not. It's like a weird phonetic.
Okay, I'm just gonna call you Ren. Okay, for short.
Call me whatever the fuck you want. As long as I know that you're talking to me, you can call me like shitface. I don't care.
Okay. Okay.
That's good to know. Antara, are you upgraded to a speaker? I don't know if I heard.
Did you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
I heard you.
We can hear you perfectly fine.
Awesome.
Cool. Rinyald,
Let's get some headphones in.
Here.
Say again.
Where were we in our discussion when we just got off just then? I think we were talking about Doge in the program.
Generally, yeah. Or like the precedent that it would set.
Yeah. Antara, what are your feels on the way Doge has had, I guess, their run so far this year?
Well, it's a bit of a mix of emotions. So, I, I don't know. Part of me is like, you don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, and I do think a lot of what's being enacted right now by Doge is very much needed. So I think what we're seeing in the immediate time frame is very good. So I don't want to criticize it too much, but my concern is more kind of the precedent that's being set. I think both giving, the richest guy in the world access, which seems like unadulterated access to the most powerful government in the world, no matter who that person may be. If you follow the principles of absolute power corrupts absolutely, part of me can't shake the feeling that it won't end well. I don't know what that'll be, but I think Elon's proven he's someone who can get what he wants, and my concern is what happens when what he wants kind of might not be in the best interest of the American people.
Yeah, because there's serious like conflict of interest situations with Musk, considering like he gets government grants, he's getting access to the treasury information, like controlling grants to potentially like competing companies. Might not be the greatest thing, but
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I actually think he's one of his companies make him the largest single recipient of government contracts. So yeah, I
wouldn't be
mean,
shocked.
hey, I would do the same thing if I were in his shoes, right? I'm building rockets and battery powered cars and all sorts of crazy things. I think it's what any shrewd business person would do. It's just the responsibility of those observing to be like, wait a second,
Yeah.
couldn't this kind of play out badly? But at the
And
same time, it's working well now, so who knows?
that hits at something else where that I think is a big problem with Doge, is that it doesn't seem like, especially since we don't really know what it is, like statutorily. It claims to be like an advisory committee, but it doesn't have the power. It has powers beyond an advisory committee, and it's not the Department of Government Efficiency that was established through the executive order. So we don't really know what Doge is, or at least the form of Doge that Elon is running. So that hits at the problem of who has oversight to this. if we don't even know what this is, who is looking over to make sure that there's not like majorly corrupt things happening? It's not Congress. It sure as fuck isn't Donald Trump. So who even has oversight as to what Elon Musk is doing right now? Because it seems like the only people he's reporting to are Donald Trump and X.
I completely agree, and I think the irony shouldn't be lost on us of an entity that's designed to provide transparency to the American people is also very much inherently not transparent, and we can't really figure out how it's working. So yeah, just kind of
especially since
there.
There's the one tweet, I don't remember who made it, but it was basically the person like talking about all of the people that are helping Elon Musk or that also had access to the Treasury information. And Elon Musk literally said, like, you sharing this information is illegal. And then the Attorney General came out and said, yeah, anyone who's sharing private information about Doge people is directly prosecutable. And then the question is like, okay, well, if these people are running our government right now, if they're getting access to my social security number, shouldn't I have the right to at least know who the fuck has that information?
I totally agree. I mean, if you're gonna act in the capacity of a public servant, you should be public, for lack of a better way to put it.
I think it's a little scary that it seems like the whole government is coalescing around somebody like Elon Musk, and the Attorney General is coming out and saying we will prosecute you if you stand in our way, when these people aren't lawfully created. I don't believe that they are following the laws. I've read a couple of the lawsuits that are filed against them. Yeah, I think it's pretty scary. Not even necessarily because they're like whatever they're finding right now, but just because like I would prefer that the president acts within the law, and it seems like Donald Trump views himself as above the law, and it seems like a lot of Trump's constituents view themselves above the law, and that's how we transition away from a democracy and towards a dictatorship.
Totally agree. And it would be one thing if it was Trump himself doing these things. He, at the very least, is an elected official, if not the utmost elected official. But we have an unelected official, essentially kind of acting like a president over here.
Yeah, we have an unelected official claiming to be taking power away from unelected officials.
Yeah, I don't even know if he's technically an American citizen. I think he is, but I know he was obviously born in South Africa and everything.
I think he was born in South Africa, but I believe he is a naturalized citizen. So at least
that makes sense.
But he wouldn't be eligible to be the president still. So.
Yep. You have to be born here. That makes sense. Now, what do you guys think in terms of forget about, not to take it away from Doge, but just some of the other things that have been happening under Trump, maybe on the foreign policy side of things or just economically?
So I'll give you my my four biggest problems right now with what Trump is doing, and we could talk about it.
Yeah, I'll speak after him, to be exact. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll speak after you.
So the first biggest problem, and I already talked to Joe about this, is that I think Donald Trump is an authoritarian, and I think he does a lot of signaling at authoritarianism. And when someone believes that they're above the law, that leads to the erosion of democracy, especially when the voters aren't willing to check that kind of rhetoric. So that's my biggest problem with Donald Trump, is that he's basically saying, hey, I want to be a king, and our people who are supposed to be against tyranny are not stepping up against that. The second biggest problem I have right now is Doge, and the fact that he's using an advisory committee with no legal authority to basically, check the power of Congress. I think that's really bad. My third biggest problem...
Can I interject for 1 second?
Yeah.
I've noticed you just mentioned there, when we were discussing earlier, I'm just making a little point, you mentioned your number one biggest focus of what Trump has been doing is the Doge itself is your one, and then you just stated a point mentioning your first point is Donald Trump being an authoritarian. And it just goes back to what I was saying earlier about the rhetoric people have against himself. Like I said, this could be a different candidate, any other name, and I don't think many people would have the same problems. So I just want to make note of that. Sorry, you can continue and you can listen.
I would make the caveat that my problem isn't necessarily like inflammatory rhetoric, as in he's like mean. It seems like my problem is that it seems like America is becoming normalized to authoritarian action because of his rhetoric. So it's not necessarily a personal problem with Donald Trump. It's a problem with the kind of things that Donald Trump is making the American people open to. Um,
I agree with that. I agree.
so okay, the third biggest thing I think is the executive order to redefine birthright citizenship. I think is insane, and it is like blatantly against the Constitution, which I think is really bad. And my fourth biggest thing is that it seems like he's kind of becoming a stooge to the Russian government. At least in his first term, like he kind of unleashed Ukraine a little bit. He was giving them like more weapons than Obama did, which was really good. And now it seems like he's kind of, cutting Ukraine out of negotiations over their border, which I think is kind of insane. If, there's negotiations about who should have, access to your land, you should probably be involved in it. And it seems like Donald Trump is kind of, reinforcing might makes right, by saying, like, Ukraine doesn't have anything to offer me, so we're not going to, give them backup, even though a world superpower is illegally and unjustifiably trying to entrench on its borders. I think that is something that the U.S., whether people like its position or not, is the world police. If we weren't the world police, it'd be China, and if China wasn't the world police, it'd be Russia. So I think the U.S. is in the best position to do that, and I think that we should be standing up for little countries when they are basically being bullied out of joining a security alliance, because, Russia doesn't want their power to be questioned. So those are my three biggest things, or four biggest things.
Well said. After Sage Master speaks, I'd like to touch upon the Ukraine thing because actually, that of the three things, I'd say I disagree with you actually most on that. But yeah, I'll hold on to my thought.
Okay. I guess for me personally, it has to do with the fact that Trump is uprooting like social like norms that were set by not just like past presidents, like George Washington, for example. Like that it's these rules and laws that he's fundamentally changing that it's going to into a direction that's less democracy, more I guess oligarchy slash a little bit fascism, I would argue. But I mainly say it's going to be not more oligarchy, because the amount of like people that Trump is like surrounding himself with Jeff Bezos, the heads CEOs of like these 500 Fortune like companies, like I view that as a bad thing, and I feel like we're heading to it like a second Gilded Age. Really.
Yeah, I do agree with that, and I mean, I guess my point on that part, I don't necessarily believe that we're heading into it. I just think the veil is being removed, and that's where I really agree with your point about Trump not necessarily being authoritarian, but normalizing authoritarianism.
Well,
I think Joe Biden
can,
was
can
an
I make
authoritarian.
a
I think.
can I make a real
Yeah,
quick
please.
amendment to that?
For sure.
I do think that Donald Trump is himself an authoritarian. But my problem with him isn't that I think he's going to be a dictator. I personally think he might, but I don't have enough to actually back that claim, other than the fact that I think he clearly wants to be one. But I would say that's a meaningful distinction. Not only do I think he wants to be an authoritarian, but he is also normalizing people to the idea of authoritarianism.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I technically agree with all of what you just said, but I should say I also am inherently very mistrusting of the government. So I believe Joe Biden was also a dictator. I believe George Bush was a dictator. I believe Obama was. I just think Trump is one where he doesn't care about hiding it as much. So yeah, I think he does want to be authoritarian, as did virtually anyone who gets to that point of the level in power. Maybe I just am cynical, but I don't think people deal with that level of just stress and being hated if it wasn't really for a love of power ultimately.
Mhm.
But besides that, in terms of Ukraine, and I think I have a slightly different perspective on this because I grew up outside of America and I came here when I was 18. um and it's tough because I do think what Russia has done is not necessarily justifiable. I think it's been terrible. I think the toll that the Ukrainians have paid is completely outrageous. But I do think there are some things that very frequently get left out of the conversation. NATO isn't just a security alliance, it is very much something that was established after World War II to kind of balance out the risk of the Soviet Union, which is no longer a thing. Now,
Well, it
one
was
of the
to be clear, it's the Soviet pack, the Soviet satellite state packs, I believe. There's another name by it.
yeah, they
Forget what
still
it.
have some semblance of unity. I agree. Like I don't know. Belarus and Russia are still going to go to war for each other, as they would have in the Soviet Union. So, but I just mean that the real purpose of NATO was to kind of be a counterbalance to this massive superpower that we didn't know if it could surpass America and the Allies. So when a lot of these things, when the lines were being drawn, there were very clear agreements of. A line in the sand kind of where NATO expansion would be considered a direct attack on the sovereignty of Russia. And I'd like to pose the question if sorry, go for it.
Yeah, sorry. I don't mean to cut you off, but I just, for the sake of like a more productive conversation, I feel like we should take things, point by point, so we're not just like monologuing at each
Sure.
other.
Yeah, please.
So I would say that yes, NATO was started because we were trying to prevent, Soviet power from expanding, or to have like a check against the Soviet Union. But I would say that NATO has proved itself to still be useful or still be a needed body because all of the countries around Russia feel the need to apply to NATO. NATO isn't something that necessarily expands itself. It's you only get NATO membership if you apply for NATO membership. So I think
and you have to spend a huge amount on your military, and there are a lot of requirements to be met.
I think it justifies itself just by extension of all of the satellite countries of Russia feel the need to be a part of it.
I mean, I don't blame them. Look at who's in part of NATO. We got America, the world's superpower. We got a lot of these other massive Western allies. It would make sense for virtually any country to want to join NATO. That's not. I'm not arguing with the rationale behind their decision.
Not only that, not only because of who is in NATO, but also what happens to countries who are not in NATO. Because we looked at Georgia, that was just a blatant land grab from Russia, and they illegally took Georgia. And we look at Ukraine. They weren't in NATO, and then Russia just illegally invaded them because they knew that they could.
Well, I think a lot of the invasion happened to do with the Crimean Peninsula, so my dad actually lived in Ukraine for a little bit and visited Russia. One of the few Americans that got to do so during the Soviet Union still being like a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he studied Russian through some university in Oberlin and through in Ohio. But anyway, a lot of these people on the eastern side of Ukraine that was very contested only spoke Russian. They didn't speak Ukrainian. They considered themselves Russian. And a lot of them petitioned saying, hey, we would actually rather be part of so and so. So a lot of the narrative that we get here of oh, no one wanted this over there. There was a lot of it was a civil war back in 2014 before all of this really reignited 3 years ago. But either way, the question I wanted to pose, let's take the reason behind NATO and the reason behind the Soviet Union out of it. If a foreign entity that was not allied with us decided to set up shop in Mexico or in Canada and start having a military alliance with them, I would be very hard pressed to believe that America would not absolutely lose their mind and go in there and make sure that does not happen. I think we would think it's a very logical thing. We did that with Cuba when Soviet Union started putting missiles there with the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, with very little hesitation even. So I think while I'm not a fan of Putin, I'm not a fan of Russian dictatorships whatsoever, I do think that a lot of this was kind of poking the bear to the point that now, unfortunately, the Ukrainians got into a war that they couldn't win. That because Russia they'll fight down to the last man. They have way more than Ukraine ever could in terms of military might and all of that. So I feel like Ukraine's just been forced to take on this crazy toll, and
I have a couple.
Now they have to.
I have a couple points I want to make to that. So the first of which is that I don't disagree that a lot of people within Crimea saw themselves as Russians, but there are two things that I think are being left out of your recounting. The first of which is that, like, international law dictates that a country cannot just invade and then hold an election on if they want to stay with that country or leave for yours. That's just not how we conduct, business anymore. And the vote that they held in 2014, the referendum, was not just held because there were so many Russians in Crimea that they felt that they wanted to, realign themselves. It was because there had already been Russian incursions into that land, and the Russian, in I don't know the proper term. The Russian side of the Civil War is the people that held the referendum. So it's not so much that the Ukrainian people just voted to become Russia. It was that Russia invaded, and then they held a referendum on whether or not they want to either become an independent territory or join Russia. It was kind of a leading question, but so
No,
that's
I get what you mean.
that's the first point that I'd make, and then the second was I think your U.S. analogy is a little incomparable, because I think it would be more akin to if the U.S. had already taken over Canada.
Wait, I can think of a better example.
Well, real quick.
The British, the British controlling the United States back in 1776. That's like a clear example of the sort of lines that we're trying to illustrate.
I would say
that Ukraine is.
I would say a more apt analogy would be if the U.S. had already taken over Canada, and the U.S. were, kind of like building people and like trying to get people on board with an incursion into Mexico, and then if Russia had a military alliance that Mexico applied for membership of, I don't think we would have as much justification to be mad there, because we've already had a history of invading the satellite countries. And it's not like Russia just came over here and offered military alliance to the people of Mexico. The people of Mexico, or the government of Mexico, applied for membership. It's not so much.
I think we're leaving out the fact that
let me get to my main point. Is
Sorry.
I said that example specifically to illustrate, like, Ukraine wants its independence, much as the same way the United States wanted its independence from Britain itself, to detach itself from its own colony and become its own independent nation. Just like that's all I want to say.
I think that's a great point, and I guess what we can all agree on is that at the very least, it's a lot more nuanced than I think any kind of overall news organization leads us to believe. Like, maybe it's not like, oh, all the people in Crimea were like, no, we love Russia. I think I'd like to learn more about what you mentioned about there was first an incursion and then the referendum was done. I don't know enough about that to argue. But I also think a lot of times those people don't get mentioned in the first place. Hey, there still is a huge population of Ukraine that considers themselves Russian. I saw something today that was a report that over 50% of Ukrainians, actually, in a poll, that aren't actively in military duty would like to negotiate with Russia and end things. And I'd like to just read this little tweet I saw. So Ukraine lost 15% of its territory to Russia. It lost 50% of the rights to its minerals to its sponsor, which is us.
Mm-hmm.
And all it cost them was about 20% of their population. So I think, unfortunately, we saw, oh, yeah, we could kind of death by 1,000 paper cuts Russia over here. Let's continue to perpetuate this conflict that realistically should have been, just never would have, been a thing. If Ukraine didn't have the support from the West, they would have already said, yeah, we surrender from the beginning. Obviously, I don't want that for the Ukrainians, but I think it begs the question, why is this our problem necessarily? Especially when regardless of the morality behind it, I don't think we can argue there are contractual agreements that said Ukraine would not join NATO, and that doing so would be viewed by Russia as a very big step over a red line.
Okay, so
he makes a very solid point on that. I know Sage mentioned, a version of colonialism. But how does this change how U.S. Should operate its country? I mean, at this point, if we allow to send millions of dollars to Ukraine and do the same in Israel, in countless places across the earth,
So
I think it's
can I respond to that real
better
quick?
we
Wait,
have this new rhetoric being involved with, Doge coming in, and maybe it sets a better precedent. Maybe we can get better laws on how to efficiently send money to countries that may as well need it. But I think we send far too much, and as Antara said, we are essentially a sponsor when
wait.
hopefully
A quick
we are more
question. Quick.
involved.
I just got back. I had this like this book that goes over the history of like Ukraine itself. It is The Great Gates of Europe: A History of Ukraine by revised edition of Surzov Pulaski. I I'll send my friend here like a photo of it, then he can like send you it. Because my shit is like fucked
Mhm.
on Twitter.
No worries.
Okay.
I'm looking
Can
it up now.
Can I make a couple points real quick?
Please.
So the one thing I wanted to really make sure I address is that there were no agreements in writing with Russia that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. The thing that people often refer to is a call between two leaders. The name is blanking on me. Basically saying that NATO would not intrude into East Germany, and he says, not 1 inch eastward. But it was actually referencing, militarization of Eastern Germany. It wasn't referencing, like NATO expansion into the whole world. And regardless, that agreement was never, inked on a piece of paper. It was, just a verbal agreement between two leaders, and it basically holds the weight of anything that I'm saying right now. So that's one of the big things, is that there was never an agreement, at least like a formalized agreement, that NATO wouldn't expand into the east. And I think it's, again, kind of a misguided talking point, because not talking point as in like it's dishonest, but talking point as in like that's just like by nature what it is. Because I don't think NATO has an expansion type interest. It's done on application. So it would be weird for somebody to promise that NATO wouldn't expand eastward when NATO doesn't necessarily hold itself as expansionist. It more so, just is an open request form.
NATO has grown since its inception, so I mean, I would say by definition it is at least partially expansionist. And then we should talk about the incentives for expansion. So, as part of one of the conditions for NATO membership, there is a certain amount of government spending that is required to go into the military, and under quite strict specifications of what type of military hardware you can have. And the overwhelming majority of the producers of those military hardware are American weapons manufacturers.
Mhm.
So when you get a country like Ukraine, for example, well, if they were to join NATO, someone's making a lot more money. So there's definitely, and we know the effect lobbying has had on our government, on all governments. I definitely think it may be a little bit.
The problem.
Sorry, go for it.
Sorry, yeah. The problem there is that like there's no mechanism by which NATO expands just on its own fruition. The only way
I mean, I
for
would
NATO
disagree.
to
Just because there's an application process doesn't mean there isn't a mechanism. Yeah,
well,
sure, it's
the
not a
only
button you hit and it says, okay, you're in, but
it's
there's
not
definitely
only
a process.
it's not only that it's an application process, but it's that the application process is the only way that you get NATO membership. So if it was something that had expansion on the mind, it would make it so the only way to
Yeah, but you're
join
like
NATO
saying like,
wouldn't
oh
be
yeah,
an
no,
application.
nightclubs don't want to. What you're essentially saying is like, oh, nightclubs don't want to have people because the only way to get in is to go through the bouncer. If they just wanted people to come in, they would just let them walk in. And
Wait,
yes, they're not
wait.
making it as easy
I
as
want to recenter
possible.
the conversation. I want to recenter the
Go for it.
conversation. Okay. So going back to like NATO expansion, I want to say when it comes to like NATO expansion specifically, I think it's good to take a look at like why the countries that joined the NATO post 1991, specifically Poland, for example, is like one clear like example
Hmm.
where they have like a history of um, of Russia being aggressive towards them. This goes back to like World War II. This goes back even it predates like you can argue it predates even like the United States itself. Like there's a long history of bad blood in parts of these Eastern Europe countries, and they simply like don't trust Russia at all. So that's why they're more likely to join NATO in the West than say Russia again. because
Yeah.
it's that expectation they had.
And I would argue that
that's all I want to say.
That's not an arm of NATO. If Russia is upset about all of its satellite countries joining NATO, the blame lies with Russia, because Russia has been famously disrespectful of the sovereignty of its satellite nations. The invasion of Ukraine, the invasion of Georgia.
I mean, I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. It's not just, oh, Russia's been bad, therefore this is what they get is people want to leave. No, we're also, back to my earlier point, trying to incentivize and actively, I think, kind of creating opportunities for people to do this. The whole reason the entire thing in Ukraine even escalated to the point that it did wasn't because they're like, oh, we're going to put in an application for NATO. It's because people on the other side of the Atlantic were like, yeah, absolutely, let's make it happen. And I think that's where it really became a bit of a red alert for Russia. And while, again, I want to reiterate, like, I don't defend any of the actions Russia has taken.
Yeah, of course.
I do also think that we don't, we're not really looking at it. And I think to truly understand anybody, you do have to look at things from their perspective. And even a bad guy is going to say, hey, like, there's a line. You guys know I'm a bad guy. Don't keep poking at me. And yeah, it sucks for Ukraine. I agree. But I just don't see why we have to take that on as our mistake and also cause hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians to get killed in the end of the day. I think Ukraine would have been better off, personally, if they just ceded the land from the beginning. They would have had more land than they're going to have to give up now, more people, and more money.
I think here's the problem, is that had there been no Russian expansion, or like threats of Russian expansion into Ukraine, Ukraine wouldn't have had the desire to even apply for NATO membership. I don't want to be too much of a stickler here, but I don't see any evidence of NATO forcing Ukraine's hand into joining NATO. I'm pretty sure the whole process was initiated by Ukraine wanting to join after seeing what happened to Georgia.
I think it's. I mean, I can't disagree, but I also think it's a little oversimplified. I think there was a lot of push and a lot of incentivizing from us that kind of allowed that to be even an option.
I agree that it's an oversimplification, but if we look back at like a history of this region specifically, there's like always been this sort of tension built in between like the Eastern Europeans and the Russians on more the Eurasian steppe specifically. Like there's always been like bad blood on some level between them, and I would say it's a long string of like of clashes over time that built up to long string like of bad blood incidents that between these two countries that led to the current like war. I would argue.
I agree.
I wouldn't even say necessarily just bad blood. I think it's it's a history of disrespect from Russia.
I agree
Ukraine
with that
had
too,
like universally accepted borders, and Russia did not respect those borders. I you could call it an oversimplification. I just don't agree.
All right, well then let me ask you this, and I'll just put it bluntly. Oh, sorry, go for it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think most of what we're discussing is a back and forth conversation about where borders are in Ukraine, but I guess the ultimate thing I kind of want to make note here is you're comparing it that Russia had no right to invade Ukraine, but essentially, if the United States has been funding the entire war efforts in Russia, wouldn't you think that even before the conflict had started, the United States was somehow involved, and that is why Russia takes back its sovereign land? So says papers. The question is what you guys are going back and forth about where those borders are. Regardless, they've been crossed, and I do think that's from the United States being the main sponsor for Ukraine, essentially acting for NATO in the case that they want to approach one of the eastern countries. I mean, who wouldn't want to surround a superpower, so they can't expand? It's natural. It's a natural way of thinking, I think, in leadership, but I think we're more going back to thinking on where that sovereign land is.
I don't agree. I might be wrong, but I'm under the impression that most of the U.S. involvement in Ukraine didn't come until the hostility from Russia, especially since
you should look into the CIA.
The leader before Zelensky was Yanukovych, and he was like famously pro-Russian, and that's why the Orange Revolution started.
Yeah, well, you should look into that revolution and how much America was actually involved in that, down to the specific protests and having people show up and having plants in there that would cause like riots and things. Like, look into the CIA's involvement with that revolution.
I'd have to see a link. The only evidence that I've seen of like an orchestrated coup during those revolutions was the Nuland Payet call, which I don't believe shows any evidence of an orchestrated coup. If you have any documentation from the CIA on the protests there, I'd like to see it.
They're not going to document it themselves. It's the CIA. It's the same organization that smuggled in huge amounts of cocaine from South America, and we don't know for sure on paper.
Wait, I want to hamper this point.
Hold on. Wait, can I?
Okay.
I'm sorry. I don't want to step on your moderator, but this is the problem that I'm seeing is that it doesn't seem like there is evidence of a CIA orchestrated coup in Ukraine, and it seems like you just conceded that by saying that, well, it's not going to be documented because it's the CIA. Well, then what's the evidence that it happened?
All right, so we just acknowledge that the CIA has never really done any of the things that we think they do, and they must largely suck because there's no documentation of it.
Well,
I think the whole fact of being in the CIA is... I think you to make a claim and say it with absolute certainty, sure, I'll give you that. To infer that it's highly likely based on a large amount of different things that I will admit I'm not prepared to volunteer right now, or I don't have at my fingertips.
Here's the problem, though, is that we're saying that the U.S. was interfering with Ukraine to give Russia justification to, feel like its borders are being threatened, but there's no evidence of the U.S. interfering in Ukraine.
Oh, you're on.
Oh, okay. Wait.
No, it's a little rough.
All right, wait, hold on. Okay, can you hear me?
Oh, wait, I think we got you back.
There we go.
My internet spikes.
Yep.
So what I was saying is that the problem is that you were citing U.S. involvement in Ukraine to give Russia some sort of justification to feel like their borders are being threatened or to feel like their security is being threatened, but there's no evidence of the U.S. actually threatening anything in Ukraine or actually being involved beyond two senators talking about who they wish is going to win the Ukrainian election.
Yeah, if you want to look up the Euromaidan or Revolution of Dignity, there's stuff. A lot of it is speculation. I'll give you that, but I think it's awfully convenient to point out that an organization whose entire job is not leaving a paper trail doesn't have a paper trail. Therefore, it can't be true.
Okay,
it's like I get it, but that's why they're so good at what they do.
I think you're unevenly putting it's awfully convenient thing though, because you can say it's awfully convenient that the CIA has interest in Ukraine and they just didn't do anything, but don't you think it's also awfully convenient that Russia can just point to the U.S. and say you guys were instigating Ukraine, even though they don't have any evidence to justify a land incursion? Isn't that also awfully convenient for Russia?
Yeah, a little bit. Sorry, go for it. Someone else is speaking.
Okay, I want to hamper this point home. I feel like this issue predates the United States itself. What I mean by that, it goes back to World War I specifically. After the Russian Empire collapsed, there was an opportunity in 1918, 1919, where Ukraine became like an independent nation. And what ended up happening is Lenin, when he got in power after the Russian Revolution, he essentially squashed the Ukrainian state. This predates the United States, and this is more a fault on, I guess, Europe itself. Specifically, not poking, be more like aggressive when Russia was at its lowest point.
Yeah, I think they allowed them too much time to recover and kind of regather their resources and reallocate things. Let me ask this to everybody, I guess. So let's say my friend here is completely right on everything and I'm totally wrong. I asked the question, then why is that still? Let's say Russia's the worst thing in the world and they had no claim whatsoever to that land, and it's 100%. There's no logic to it whatsoever. Why is that our problem? What are we getting from it? Is the first question, and the second is, are Ukrainians better off? now.
It's our problem because Russia is a nuclear power state. To be clear, like that's like one clear like reason
Well, not only
why
that,
we should be.
I think a big so the the question of why
I would
is the
say
U.S.
Russia being a nuclear, just really quick, I would
Yeah.
say actually our involvement has increased the risk of Russia's nuclear arsenal exponentially. Russia hasn't not had nuclear weapons since the end of World War II. Thankfully,
I
we're
mean,
still
well,
here.
to be clear,
Um,
they had nuclear weapons in 1949. That's when they obtained the bomb specifically.
oh, did I say
Um,
before? I meant right after. Sorry. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, I've
because
seen the footage of them
1945, that's when
testing
the
them,
Manhattan
and
Project was completed, and we got the bomb.
yep.
But
So
the
for over
question
70 years, you know,
the question as to why the U.S. is like the world superpower or the world police, as some people like to put it, is because realistically somebody has to do it, and it seems like we are the most qualified people to do it. Because if we were not the world police, then China becomes the world police, and we don't want China expanding their power either, because they are way more ripe for misuse than the U.S. is. And if it's not China, then it's Russia, and we've already seen that they are way more ripe for misuse than we are. So it seems like,
I mean,
is
from
the
someone
U.S.
who
perfect?
criticized it, you sound awfully in favor of might makes right.
So
And from
that's
someone,
No,
why
I grew up in the Middle
it's not a
East.
matter of might makes right. It's a matter of this is a power vacuum that needs to be filled, and it seems like we are the best people to do it because it seems like we are the least likely to misuse that power.
Exponentially.
to add to your
Uh,
point,
eh,
Rinyald,
I'll speak after you. Okay.
to add to your point about the United States being the world police, do you think it's in the best interest of the United States to keep spending all this money on countries and protecting, I guess, world free democracy, if we want to call it that?
Yes.
There's no doubt we have helped Ukraine and helped countless other countries. Do you
I would
think it's in
argue
the
we've
best
hurt them
interest?
tremendously.
So that was my point. Is do you think we've done more damage and could be using these resources because we are falling off the political stage? Russia is arguably a big power, and including China as well. So how can you fight the point and say this is so bad, Russia, when the United States has done very similar acts? I mean, we're
I
just
would argue
calling
far
for it.
worse, in
So
my opinion.
the first part is that I think it's I don't think the U.S. has done as much harm as they have good.
Dude,
Mostly by extension.
we invaded Iraq and killed 1 million
I
people under
understand
the
that,
guise
and
of weapons of mass destruction.
obviously, the U.S. is not perfect. Obviously, I'm
Name
going
another
to
country that's
criticize
even gotten close to that, though. To
gotten
that
close to
level of a
what?
blunder. To unjustifiably killing 1 million people with a total false cause in a totally sovereign nation, full invasion, pretty much what you're describing, but with less justification. Name another country that's done something close to that bad
Again,
the last 50 years.
Nazi Germany, to be clear.
Yeah, I
Nazi
mean,
Last
Germany.
50 years. Last 50
it
years.
depends on how far back we go. But I'm not
Let's
saying that the U.S. is perfect with the way it uses its power.
let's just say
but
since
but
the
fact
rewriting of
the
the rules
matter
of
is,
World War II.
the fact of the matter is, the
Saddam Hussein
you
in
are-
1991.
the problem is that
Invading
Invaded
the
Kuwait,
Kurds.
correct?
you're using an example of the president leading us into a war after 9/11 as an example of the U.S. being wildly
Yeah,
irresponsible
but Iraq
with its
had
power.
nothing to do with 9/11.
I agree, and that was a wild oversight. But the problem is that the justification there was that we just got hit with a crazy terrorist attack that killed one of the biggest cultural touchstones of our country. Now, I'm not saying that justified the war in Iraq. Obviously, it didn't. But to say that it's on equal justification as Russia literally just saying, I want Georgia, and then going in and taking Georgia is insane.
Well, Russia
Well,
could at least say, "Oh, they're on our border. There's this, there's that." We literally
They're
just
on
were like, "Oh,
wait,
you guys
hold on.
look like
Wait,
the
I
people
wanna
that
make
They're
this
on our
distinction.
border. They're on our border is not a justification.
I
Well,
think it's a
okay,
lot more of a
Wait,
justification
I wanna make
compared
this
to they're
distinction
across the
between,
world and
like,
had
why.
nothing to do with
Really?
what happened to
Wait,
us.
do you really think
I have
that it
another
is an
point
equal
to that.
justification to say they are on our border and we want the land as it is to say we just got hit with a wild terrorist
No,
attack
no,
and
no.
we want to
I don't think it's
hold the
equal at
people
all.
to
Perfect
account?
comparison. Hey,
Let
Wait,
me
wait,
just say this one
tone it
thing,
down
then
a little
I'll
bit.
then
Tone it
I'll
down a little bit.
sorry.
I'm gonna
I'll
be
say
fair.
one
Tony,
thing and then I'll
tone it
pass
down.
the mic. I'll
you're
say one
right.
thing just to answer that, and I'll pass the mic.
Go ahead, Tony.
You're right. I don't think it's equal. I think it's far more logical to have, a conflict across borders than to go across the world, kill 1 million people who did not attack you,
But you're
just
not
simply because you had been attacked by someone. I actually
you're
think
not looking at the
countries get into
intention. They
What?
invaded Iran because they were going off of false information. It's not because they wanted to just go into Iran and take all of the land and leave. That was the intention of Russia invading Ukraine.
Wait, okay,
Yeah, but
Ren,
look
can
at
I
the repercussion. The
wait,
intention is
can I
almost
speak?
irrelevant.
Yeah, go
Please
Wait,
go
go
ahead.
for it.
can I speak? Okay,
Please.
my main okay, I can point to you like why the United States why you should care. Okay, because it's okay, so it comes down to this. See, in the United States, we have elections. We can vote our representatives out of office, be it in 2 terms, be it 4 terms for the president. Okay.
Mhm.
I say this because in the United States, we can hold our representatives accountable on state and local levels by going to their town halls and speaking out against them. But you can't exactly do that in China or in Russia. You just get shot. This is because it's my main point is this: the United States and the United States people specifically, we can hold our leaders accountable for their stupid ass decisions, like invading Iraq or invading Afghanistan. Unlike Russia, who didn't do that at all when they invaded, like in Georgia, 2008. They did it in 2014, or even now in 2022, the 2022 invasion. I want to like that's why you should care and why it does like that is that being a world power, the United States being a world power matters.
So you made a
I
very
think
good. He made a very I guess not outrageous, because we do know that if you step up politically in more of a communist nation, you are going to be looked at a lot differently than you would be doing the same act here in America. Um, for the claim that you get shot, what makes you think that United States hasn't done that to some of their own citizens? It's just not as publicized as it would be in a communist nation. Um, I think there's
great
a
point.
lot of looking at Russia as a very bad place, so you don't want it to at least get more westward. 100% agree. We need to keep this democracy. I mean, this I guess history lesson for everybody, because it hasn't been done to this level. I would disagree and say that Russia is bad for this sense too. I mean, there are more cases, more publicized, of Russia killing its citizens than you have seen in the United States. But how can you justify the United States' policing on the entire world when Russia has the same job to do on their side of the world?
Because
Okay,
because
so
our
I
motivations
haven't
are
seen any evidence
inherently.
of like the United States specifically killing its own citizens. But if you have any evidence that points in that direction, I would like to know.
I
It's
could probably
I can change
find
my
some,
mind on this
but
if there are
it's
clear
not
evidence on this stuff.
unrelated.
This.
Yeah, I can definitely look for that. Like I said, I'm not entirely prepared tonight. I could try to find it while we're on this space, so please give me the time
Well,
to
I
do
I
that. But
think America just does
it's
a better job with
definitely,
it, so they
yeah,
just disappear and people don't ask
that's what I was
questions.
getting at. That's what I was getting at. There has been cases of Americans misusing, their own government. Hunter Biden's laptop was a big issue. You get the Hillary Clinton emails. I mean,
But
you have tons of scandals here in the United States that are publicized, but not to the
but
level that it would be
are
in
Can
we
I also
Russia.
just ask you
seriously
a question,
are we
not to be
wait
snooty?
real quick are we seriously saying that something like Hunter Biden's laptop or Hillary Clinton's private email server is on level with the corruption we see within the Kremlin?
I'm not sure that's an easy comparison to make, but it's definitely looked at this abuse of power in America. And how else could you put those ideas forward if you don't have the power? So
Any
there has
hierarchical
been
Oh,
corruption.
any
There has
wait,
hierarchical
been
I will bite the
system.
bullet. I will bite the bullet on that and say, yeah, I think we're reaching levels of Kremlin corruption with Elon
There's
specifically. To be
no
clear,
there's no
because
shot. We're not even there
that
yet.
was my question.
we're getting
Okay,
close. I would argue, but
Could
that's
that
I
just
was
my
ask a
opinion.
question to everybody, just out of
that was my
curiosity? How
question.
many countries have you guys been to outside of America?
One. Or no. I've
One?
outside of America, I've only been in America.
All right. Anyone else?
I went to I went to Mexico.
Oh,
Um,
cool. I've never
I
been.
went to
so
Key West.
All right, so I'll just say I've been to 16 countries throughout my life outside of America. And I'm not saying I'm a know-it-all or anything, but I am saying a lot of times the narrative we hear here is so different from there. I haven't been to Russia. I've been to China. China's pretty damn cool. When we look at China on the news, it sounds like Mordor. A lot of times we really do a very good job stateside of making everyone else look like the bad guys, and they're doing the same thing on their end. I think the real moral here is we're all pretty bad. You're never going to find evidence that makes America look as bad in corruption as Russia. I'll concede that point. I think Russia is inherently far more treacherous with its corruption. It's not even close. But we are still corrupt. And because of our power, smaller levels of corruption and mistakes on our end can cause far more damage than other countries. If Uganda decides to do some things under the table, yeah, it could be really bad. If we do, it can cause international catastrophes, which we've seen. So I also think with great power comes great responsibility. You can't just say, "Oh yeah, America's not as bad as some of these other places." Yeah, we don't have to be to cause the same amount of damage.
Yeah, which
Example,
is
Iraq.
why we hold our representatives accountable
Well, can I-
by voting them out of office and replacing new ones.
I will say
you can go
that
around.
Agreed.
any system that is hierarchical is obviously going to have corruption because, like, I think it was I don't remember. Somebody here said absolute power corrupts absolutely. Any system where you give people power is necessarily going to have some level of corruption. But the problem is that making comparisons between us and Russia and the level of corruption that we have is insane. And I will say that it's cool that you've gone to so many countries, but you have to also understand that you're getting the tourist view of that country. When you go to China, you're getting what China wants you to see. But you
Yes and no, but I also,
you
I'm
live-
not.
do you live in America?
Yeah, I live in Massachusetts.
So you absolutely have a more in-depth understanding of how America functions and the debate within our country, especially since, in comparison, we have a very open, free-flowing communication amongst our voters. That doesn't exist.
We have the
in
best
Russia,
in the
that
world,
doesn't
and I
exist
do
in
want to
China.
just say that.
Yeah, because
Of course,
we have
I agree.
because we have freedom of speech, rights.
Agreed.
So when you go to these
Pretty
countries,
close, yeah.
when you go to these countries, you're seeing what the government allows you to see because their people don't have the same level of freedom to speak our minds in the same way that we do. So
Yes and no. Like in North Korea, sure. If you go to like France, it's not. it- it's just not always as bad as I think we think it is. And
yeah,
yes, I
not in
agree.
like
I get the
not in any
tourist view.
not in any EU country, but if you go to like China or to Russia, you're not going to find anybody who is not pro-Chinese or pro-Russian because that's
I went
what
to
they are.
Turkey,
That's what they
and
have to
Turkey
be.
has a pretty significant dictatorship. And I was a tourist, but after a while, you start to become a bit of a nosy tourist, and you talk to people a little more. I was there for 2 weeks. You learn. I remember there was this Kurdish guy, and if you guys want to find out about other unfairness in the world, look at the history of the Kurds. Um, Not to be confused with the cheese, but
I know
I
the
remember them
Kurds
telling
specifically
me.
from 1991. That whole conflict refers to Iraq invasion, I believe.
Yeah,
With
I honestly, you might know more
Saddam
about it than I
Hussein.
do. So there were a lot of Kurds in Iraq, and like Saddam brutalized them, I believe, and a lot of them fled to Turkey. And I think Turkey was also incredibly hard on them, and they're basically a very, very persecuted people. But I
Yeah,
remember hearing all sorts of negative things about the Turkish government and learning, and I guess I'm just trying to say, even a tourist's perspective will sometimes turn on that light bulb in your head of like, oh. We've been told
from
not the total truth. A lot of it might be true, but I would just beg you guys to just ask yourselves, what don't I see? I think we've done a very good job of painting Russia as this just black and white, good versus evil, they're bad, we're
to be
good.
clear, that's like
I think
that's due to like 50. That's been like 60 years of like the Cold War propaganda against Russia.
Of
There's
course.
some level
well,
of
real
truth.
quick,
There's some level of truth to it, but
I reject that. I
Yeah.
think that I mean, I'm someone who, I
I'm
talk to a
speaking
lot
from
of
like
people.
an American standpoint. But
Yeah, I know. I talk to a lot of people. I interact with a lot of people. It's definitely not the case that our current media environment doesn't give the opportunity for pro-Russian voices to speak. Donald Trump is the president. We have Candace Owens. We have Tucker Carlson. They're all very keen to give pro-Russia apologia. Our system is very open. A lot of people talk about being pro-Russian. I've heard most of the pro-Russian talking points. I've honestly heard a lot of the things that you cited to me today. The difference between the American or the Western perspective on Russia, and the Russian perspective on Russia is that Russia gives nothing to back up their perspectives other than the Kremlin said so. And we have actual documentation and actual like historical context and corroboration from other countries.
Well, I think even your framing there just shows a little bit of bias, though, because being able to say that, hey, I don't think us being involved with the war in Ukraine is a good idea, doesn't by default make it a pro-Russian stance. And I
No,
think a lot of
it
these
doesn't,
people
but-
who are, you just called pro-Russian, a lot of times they're just saying, hey, this isn't our issue. This sucks for Ukraine. Our hearts are with them.
Us wanting to remove influence from Ukraine is not necessarily pro-Russian, but what is pro-Russian is when we say that Russia obviously would have wanted to invade because there's so many ethnic Russians in Crimea. That's something that is basically, I'm not saying that you're like a Russian propagandist or whatever, but this is something that is directly beamed down from the Kremlin, and whenever you see like paid Russian state actors, these are the same talking points that they give. Is that, of course, Crimea wanted to join Russia. That's why we held the referendum. That's why, so all of these ethnically Russian people from Crimea wanted to join Russia. And then they leave out the fact that the, referendum happened after Russia invaded. And they leave out the fact that the reason that there are so many ethnic Russians in Ukraine is because of the Holodomor under the Soviet Union, where they were basically starved the entire country of Ukraine and then sent a bunch of ethnic Russians there to cover it up. So whenever Russia gives an account of course this happened because, they just love Russia so much, they're going to leave out billions of key details. And I've noticed with almost everybody who doesn't take a pro-Ukrainian stance, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but I've noticed this with almost everybody I've talked to who doesn't support Ukraine, is that they conveniently have a lot of those pro-Russian talking points in their head.
Well,
Tim Pool, to be clear, Tim Pool.
Tim Pool is getting
okay.
paid by Russia, so that's a slightly different thing.
I agree. Yeah, they caught him red-handed. I don't
him
like
and
Tim
Ben
Pool
Johnson and
Wait,
I was
David
happy.
I want to hammer in this point
real
home.
quick.
Well,
I gotta go to the bathroom. I'll be right back.
Okay, I want to hamper in. I want to hamper in this point, like say similar corruption. I think there's a clear if I would speak as it had to specifically state an era where corruption was very high in this country. It'll be the Gilded Age, specifically under the Grant administration. That's where all the corruption really stemmed from. Really began, I would argue, and really got really bad.
Agreed. Yeah, you had the robber barons like Charles Schwab and
Rockefeller. You got all these other ones. So
I actually sorry, really quick. I actually met a Rockefeller once, like an actual Rockefeller. His last name was Rockefeller. I was working in a store and we had to send him something, and his address was 1 Rockefeller Plaza in New York City.
So
sorry,
so if we want to say a comparison, I'll point to you clear example being Rockefeller specifically, but I guess in this case situation, I guess the United States got lucky because what was it? McKinley got shot. We got Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, into office because he was vice president. And we got lucky because it's through him that we were able to crush monopolies under him.
Yeah,
I think it was the Garfield monopoly. There's a that goes after monopolies. There's a piece of legislation that was passed before Theodore Roosevelt came into office. But it was Roosevelt specifically
the predecessor of antitrust laws, essentially.
Yeah, antitrust. Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
Yep. This was my other point to your adding on, how such a president he was. I think we go back and look at the American experiment on the way we've done government since being we became country 1776. Constitution was signed.
I believe we gained our independence by 17. I can't name top of my head. The war started in 1776. But
gotcha. The entire American experiment is new, and if you can just simply take the America word out of it and compare that file to Russia, we are just a younger version of what ultimately I think this nation is falling to. Is a level of corruption. I mean, we've had.
I wouldn't say that comparison works. I would point to Rome specifically as a more clear example, because the Roman Republic and all that.
and that goes all back to my point of I don't think
Because the United States is republic based off like the ideals of Rome, which goes back to the Greeks that established democracy, direct democracy itself.
Yeah, and ultimately, I like to compare this back to like the fact that I don't think we should be funding other countries and essentially being the world's police. You know, being its mother. I think the United States has fallen off of a very great path we had, and in very recent decades, we have fallen to the level of corruption that we do see in the Kremlin, and we have seen things not go the true American way that it should. I mean, I would argue and say the American dream isn't alive in this
You
country and
literally
hasn't been
said
for some
that
time
we
now.
don't have
Um,
similar
entitlements have
levels of
crippled
corruption
us.
in the
We
Kremlin,
got everything
and then
going on in the
said
world.
that we're falling to
And
similar
that's
levels of
why I
corruption
am
as
a
the Kremlin.
favor of a president who is putting America first rather than saying we're peacekeepers of democracy. I think some of the rhetoric he does push is bad, but going to my point of saying United States should not be worrying about these outside problems as much as they have been and focus more on the internal because we are close to that collapse as Sage was comparing it to the Roman Empire. Often when you find yourself in such a corrupt government where this great experiment is now falling out from underneath us. I think there's more
Okay,
work
like
that
okay,
needs
to
to
be
take place.
clear, like the United States becoming a world power is before World War II, more specifically the Korean War. The United States wasn't like this before the Korean War at all. We're kind of what I mean by this is like if you look at after World War II, we slimmed down our military. We slimmed down like we cut our military in half. We cut like everything. We did that as usual, like we did in the Civil War after it. We slimmed down our army, made it smaller. Um, so this idea of being a world power is a modern idea specifically.
Real quick, can I?
But I would argue it's a more it's a I would argue it's sort of it's a good thing in a weird way, even though I will admit the United States is fucked up throughout the Cold War itself and throughout like even to the modern day with the invasion of Iraq. But I think on some level the United States has spread some level of good
Can I ask?
through its ideal.
Can I ask 2 questions?
Yeah.
1, do you think that if the U.S. got rid of its position as the world police, that would leave a power vacuum? Do we agree with that?
No, I don't. I don't
Not
think so.
necessarily
Really?
if we continue the, as you like to call it, pro-Russia. I would rather call it a more of seat at the
Pro
table.
America, like
Um,
let's just focus on us. And
let's be
here's the thing
frank.
about the world police angle that I'd like
Well,
to
real
think.
quick.
Like,
Can I?
go for it. Sorry.
Sorry, I wanna try and stay focused on this one particular thing before we move on. So, can we agree that even right now, as we're seeing the U.S. aid paused, or while we saw the U.S. aid paused, that China was already trying to move into the territories which were no longer receiving U.S. aid?
Yeah,
we
I
already
totally
saw
agree.
that?
And China's been doing that for decades. Yeah.
Okay.
Like, look at what happened in Afghanistan. Taliban took over. They built power plants. They built roads. They did all these. They
Right,
moved in there
so-
like in the blink of an eye. I
So,
agree.
would we rather see that power vacuum filled by the United States, or would we rather see it filled by China?
Again, it's this ultimatum of black and white thinking of like, oh, it's either this or it's that.
Who else
It's
would
America or
fill-
it's
No,
China, so it's
it's
good or
called
it's bad.
Who else would fill
It's
that?
called
It doesn't have to necessarily be filled. It
Well,
can
if
just kind of.
we just agreed
China's
But
that
that's
going to
not
continue to
realistic, though.
exert its
We
influence
just-
in other places.
we just agreed that if the United States were to stop giving aid to certain countries, China would swoop in there like a hawk. So it is kind of
And-
black and white. If we stop giving aid to these countries, China is going to swoop in. So who would we rather see in that position, the United States or China?
Honestly, for some
So-
things, let China have it. Go for it. Like, why are we
That's what I
so
was going
afraid
to
of
say.
China? What's
That's
going to
exactly
happen
what I
if
was gonna
they,
say.
involve themselves a little bit more in Ukraine or in Taiwan or all these things? Like, yeah, I get it on it.
Because
I mean,
Black
they're
and white level,
communists.
if it's
That's
super
one
simple.
thing.
at that
Yeah,
point,
I've
we're
been
moving
to
back
China.
to-
It's super communist.
At that point, we're moving
There's-
back to like the imperial world, where we're like seeing like different imperialist conquests not really checked by anything, and that's just going to become the norm again.
I mean,
Because
that's what
China
we're
has
in
interest in
now.
this.
Which
It's
led to
just
World War
proxy
One,
wars.
to be clear.
That's not what we're in now. The U.S. hasn't done a territory grab like that. We've had
They just do
wars.
proxy wars.
Yes, that's not the same.
So let me ask you this, Ronald,
Proxy
then.
wars are absolutely 1000% better than territorial conquest wars. It's better for us to fund separatist groups than for China to literally invade a country and then take it.
Yeah, I mean, it worked great in Afghanistan. It's worked really well in so many places.
I'm not saying that it's good, but I'm saying it's better than China literally coming into Taiwan and saying your land is mine now, or Russia coming into Ukraine and saying your land is mine now. Well,
I think let them have a little bit of land. Sure, if they want to do it, they can do it. We're going to develop.
Yeah, but that's called
the
appeasement, though.
That's the fall. That's the fall of the modern world, is what you're describing right now.
I think so. Your perspective is we have to consistently exert effort to keep other countries from improving so that we can stay on top.
No,
I don't think that's accurate.
Not to prevent them from improving, to prevent them from doing imperialism, to prevent them from doing land grabs.
How is that not improving?
Because it's not.
I just meant it in a binary sense. Like, they're going to acquire more land. It's a net positive for them, you know?
Yeah, technically.
Not for whoever they're attacking.
If I kill my coworkers, it's going to be better for me. So I can't say to the cops, oh, why are you preventing my well-being? Because it's deeper than that. You're
all right, touche. I get what you mean.
You're helping your own country at the expense of another country.
Wait, Red, I want to back you. Let me hammer in on this point. Like, okay, let's say let's say the United States doesn't involve itself in these. We pull out. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what we're ended up if the United States like pulls out back to its pre-World War II like or Korean War superpower status, what we're end up doing is essentially repeating essentially what led to World War I again, which was imperial conquest and alliance building that end up causing the Great War, quotation marks, okay? You can even go even further. The Napoleonic Wars were about like land grabs itself, acquiring like territory and building an empire out of that. So
your best solution would be to fund the country,
and that goes even further. If we go back even to that era, we're dealing with we still have like nuclear weapons, so it's doubly as dangerous, I would argue.
So
I'm a big believer in mutually assured destruction. I think everyone having nuclear weapons keeps everyone from using them to a certain extent.
I mean, it's game theory.
It is. I agree.
The solution here would be to fund other countries and essentially shroud those countries who would fend on the imperialism. So
that's what we're doing like with South Korea, though.
Our best deterrence is to fund other countries in a critical time in the last couple decades. I mean, I think we all can agree the United States was a lot more richer before 1960, and beyond before that. After the war, we inherited such a large-scale role that I don't think we need to uphold as much as we do. And I think getting Russia on board, and instead of saying Russia is bad and all these communist countries are absolutely horrible, which they have done some incomparable hacks, but we need to like think about what's a different solution, because currently the ones we are producing now are quite horrible for this country. I would agree on.
I agree. I'm in favor of them. Can I add one really quick?
I'll let Ren speak. Ren speak.
Go ahead.
All right, go.
Here's the problem, though, is that you're asking us to stop saying Russia is bad, even though they're still doing bad stuff. We shouldn't just let Russia walk off of a blatant power grab in Ukraine at the expense of Ukraine's borders because we want some sort of alliance with them. That's not going to be tenable. We can't set the standard that Russia can just do whatever it wants and then still get our stamp of approval because it's they're a world superpower.
Look, in a perfect world, you're right. If we had all the funds and it wasn't something where we're really hurting ourselves to help, we should help absolutely every small little guy out there. I totally agree. But let's stop talking in theory. Let's talk in practice. So we helped Ukraine. We gave them what, $300 billion so far? More, I believe. Let's ask, did this help? Did interventionism help Ukraine? Did it help us? Did it hurt Russia? Russia has more land than they did before. Yes and no. Their economy's bouncing back. They're not doing as badly as a lot of us thought. I saw this funny video on Twitter where it was like,
their economy's in shit, to be honest, and their Russian Navy is completely fucking destroyed. Their economy's in
shit and their military is destroyed. It absolutely.
Their Navy specifically, because if you look at their Navy, they're fucked.
I would strongly encourage looking up some other things. There's a lot more to the Russian military than I think we're thinking. I think they can continue this in perpetuity. Of course, they're going to hurt. But look at World War II. The Russians, unfortunately, have suffered tremendous amounts there, and it's kind of in their
Two,
blood. They
yeah,
know pain.
but we gotta. But even in World War II
But let's just go
specifically,
back
it
to the
wasn't.
question though. Did it help?
Wait. I want
Did it
to
help
hammer in
Ukraine? Did it help
this point.
us?
They hammer in this point. Like, to be clear, to be exact, like it was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union comprised of Ukraine, Russians, Belarusians, Poles, and a bunch of other like Eastern European countries, Lithuanians. So the Soviet Union was a combination of those countries that beat the Nazis.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure like 70% of Ukrainians, majority of the Ukrainians fought in the Soviet Union specifically as well. So I want to just factually just point that out.
No, it's a good point.
And I
But
would say that,
if
yeah,
someone could
this-
answer my question though, did it help
do
Ukraine
think,
and did it help
this
us?
helped Ukraine. And the reason is because Ukraine wanted to fight for its borders. The war in Ukraine was popular amongst Ukrainians. They have, I mean, we don't, we're kind of insulated from this train of thought because, U.S.'s borders aren't going to be compromised by anybody because we're the strongest country in the world. But oftentimes, when a country's borders are being threatened, their like sense of country is being threatened. The war in Ukraine and Zelensky, by extension, was hyper popular amongst the Ukrainian people. At least I'm like 90% sure of that. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is this sends a message to Russia that they can't just fucking do whatever they want. Us helping.
But that's exactly
Ukraine
what they
fighting
did, and they're getting away with it.
No, they're not getting away with it. They may be getting more land, but realistically, their economy is in the fucking toilet. Putin's approval ratings were at an all-time low during this war, and their military is ripped to shreds. We can't pretend like this wasn't a learning experience for Vladimir Putin.
And to be clear, this invasion specifically, it's more costly than the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a 10-year war. Russians lost more lives in this war than the Soviet Union ever did. And that war, the Soviet Afghan war was very bloody. To be clear.
So let's say, okay, it did hurt Russia. When you say it did help Ukraine because they wanted to fight, if your kid says, hey, I want to go get in a fight, you don't just let him because he wants to, because it might not actually be worth it regardless of his interest.
I think
a better analogy is if your kid is being bullied, you tell them to fight back. And almost every parent will tell them
against an
kid
adult,
to fight back.
against an adult, if it's an adult that's bullying them,
well then,
like a full-grown man, and you got a 10-year-old,
the parent should probably help the kid fight back against the adult then, which is what we did.
Or you should figure out what the problem is, why this adult is attacking your child.
To be clear, this war is more. To be clear, this war is more of a peer-to-peer like war.
Wait, can we stick on that analogy real quick?
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Okay,
yeah.
Let's say we're trying to find a resolution between the adult that just unjustifiably punched your kid in the face. Your kid comes to you and he says, "Hey, I need help," and then you come to the parent that just punched your kid in the face and you say, "Hey, how can we resolve this situation?" And the parent says, "I need to punch your kid in the face one more time." Would you ever take that?
No, if that's what they said. But if they say, hey, your kid, I believe your kid stole something from me. And he didn't steal anything. But there is a person right here, an adult, in a moment, they're about to punch your kid again. Do you hand your kid some brass knuckles, or let me arm you? No, it won't matter what you give him. He's not going to win the fight. So ultimately,
so you just let him
I think as an adult, you say, no, let me do what I got to do so you don't hurt the kid anymore.
Wait, okay, there's a better analogy of this. The United States at this point, we're like the French in the American like Revolution. Okay, like there's a possibility of independence with George Washington getting to create the United States. Okay, and there's a higher chance of George Washington losing that army and losing against the world's greatest power, which was Britain at that time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a high chance of that. But we stick to them. We stick with the Americans in this situation, in this analogy, specifically because we want to fuck over our peers, our world power peers, because we hate them.
Yeah.
There's a benefit in fucking them over when they're at their weakest.
When you
So that's
win, yeah, we won the Revolutionary War. It worked. They made the calculation. It was a correct calculation. We didn't beat Russia.
no. To be
Ukraine's
clear,
losing a huge amount of
to
natural
be clear, it was
resources.
the French that won the American Revolution. To be clear on
Yeah,
that,
yeah, I
with
think it was the
their
Marquis de
arms
Lafayette
and
was
their men.
I agree.
Lafayette played a key role in modernizing our military.
Yeah,
But
my
it really
point
was
is
the French that.
my point is the French and the Americans won the Revolutionary War. We have in no way helped Ukraine win this war. On
I mean,
paper, if you're looking at it as a board game, Ukraine lost. Yes, they both suffered huge casualties.
I
Maybe
mean,
Russia suffered
but
double.
war isn't a board game though. It's multifaceted. It's evolving.
I would say
Um,
it's very similar to a chess game. I mean, that this whole conflict on the East has benefited United States zilch. Just besides to say that we helped fight back against a communist nation. We have been so against a power like that climbing, understandable, but the United States has climbed in a very similar way. And I
Yeah, I mean, think of
understand
what we could have
I
done with that $300 billion
I don't I
it's a
don't
lot of
domestically.
I
money,
don't agree that
it's a
we're
lot of
acting
support.
comparably to Russia. We're not like we haven't been doing anything similar to what Russia just did with Ukraine. I don't think there's even an analog to anything
Even
like
if
that
that's
in
true,
U.S.
again,
history.
why is this? I get
Well,
sure you're right. Let's say we're
Hawaii
not as bad as Russia, and I agree. Russia's way worse. I'm just still saying, what did we gain from all of these great
We gained a
talking points
weakened
you gentlemen are
we
making?
gained a weakened Russia. That's what we gained. We gained a Russia that isn't as willing to just do imperialist wars for the sake of land grabs. We're fighting against a norm amongst the entire world that imperialism is okay again.
All right, as long as we acknowledge that we just used Ukraine as a pawn and just decimated their
I
country, and
mean,
now they got the
to
shit end of the stick, so we can
Not
weaken
only,
Russia. I agree
I
with
mean,
you.
to be
not
clear,
that
they're
simple.
using
It's not
us
that
as well. They're
yeah,
using us as
it's not
well
that simple
by
because
buying
Ukraine wanted to be in that war. That was a wildly popular war amongst Ukrainians. So it's not that we were just using them to get at Russia. Ukraine also wanted
I
to
mean,
fight against Russia
it was
invading
initially,
their
but there was
borders.
also a point. For sure, initially, but later on, a lot of Ukrainians, the tide shifted very quickly, and the money kept coming, the bombs kept coming. Um, if it truly was just about focusing on what the
you're
Ukrainians want,
oversimplifying it though. You're oversimplifying it.
And also,
Because it was that
sorry, go ahead.
it you're oversimplifying it because the reason like why Ukrainians started to be disgruntled from the military was the lack of aid, and that due to Republicans when they getting into the midterm back in 2022 when they gained the midterms, they blocked any more aid to Ukraine, and they stipulated on the fact that they wanted a stronger immigration bill.
mm.
So it's much more nuanced than just simply that.
I would
So
also,
our actions directly affected their decisions on the battlefield specifically.
I would also say I reject on its face this notion that this was just a proxy war for the U.S. to get at Russia when Russia initiated this war. They started this war by illegally invading Ukraine. So to frame this as the U.S. just trying to get at Russia, if Russia didn't want to open themselves to that position, they shouldn't have illegally invaded one of their satellite states.
Yeah, I don't think what Russia did should have happened. I agree with that. But we had a decision then to be like, all right, there's a world superpower here. We could get closer to nuclear war than ever before. Ukraine is going to suffer tremendously from this. We're going to lose $300 billion, half of which, by the way, is unaccounted for. We don't know where it went.
Okay,
Zelensky said on camera, I don't know where it went. Is all of that worth it just to hamper Russia a little bit? In 5 years, they'll probably be back
it
where they
isn't
were.
just hampering them home.
Yeah.
It's not just hampering them home. It's about decisively striking a blow to them that they won't recover for years or maybe even decades on end.
Well, not only
I
that,
think
it's
that's wishful
also,
thinking at best.
I think we're ignoring this point is that it's setting the standard for superpowers to operate on the world stage. It's setting the precedent that bigger countries can't just come in and bulldoze smaller countries without absolutely tanking every single aspect of their country.
But my friend, we have already set that precedent.
We have not set that precedent. We haven't done a land grab like that.
In terms of land grab, sure, but we've gone into places and demolished, and maybe we're a little more sophisticated. But Obama sent so many
Hawaii,
drones into Yemen.
To be clear, it was Bush that got us into Iraq.
Iraq,
Afghanistan is
but
probably
look up
justifiable.
Obama's track record on
Yeah, but it was
drone
Bush. But our
assassinations.
invasion of Iraq happened under like George W. Bush.
Oh yeah, no,
again,
trust me, I remember there were protests outside my house with like pictures of Bush
again,
and blood in his face.
And
I remember
we're
it clearly.
ignoring-
I mean,
we're ignoring the
I mean-
incentive here, because when we were doing the drone strikes on Yemen, again, I think that those were bad, but the intention was to fight back against a terrorist cabal, which is like a pretty decent incentive, or at least a much more moral incentive than doing it just because you have land and I want it.
Well, I think if you were to ask the Russians, they wouldn't say, "Oh, it's because they had land and we wanted it." I think
Yeah,
they would also
what
say,
they
"Oh,
would
we
say
have
is
an
it was-
incentive, so and so,"
Yeah, but
and they could
Russian
easily look at what
incentive-
we said and said that what we did is unjustifiable.
Every Russian incentive is bullshit, though. That's the problem.
I mean, I think some of ours were too. Like, literally,
I mean,
let's
they
just
haven't
use
used
Iraq
that
as
to,
an
like, lie.
easy point
Was
for
there
me.
not terrorism in Yemen?
Yeah, the guys in their sandals in mountains were not a huge threat to us, and the
We
collateral
literally- we were
damage
just
we
coming off of
caused and the
9/11.
famines. Yeah, who was not caused? But someone.
What do you mean
I
that terrorism wasn't a threat to the United States? We literally just had two of our biggest buildings blown up in a fucking.
So we can just
airplane
attack
attack.
random Arab countries?
No.
You
No,
also? So
that's
it's
not what I'm
justified because we got
If
attacked?
it was
That's not what I'm saying.
Afghanistan, to
I'm
be
saying
clear,
it's
that's where
more
the stuff
justified.
happened
I'm
from.
saying it's more justified. It's more justified to fight back against terrorism than to invade Ukraine either on false pretenses or because you want this land.
If you fight back against the terrorists, I would agree. When you're bombing little kids in a country that had nothing to do with it, I'm sorry, buddy. Like you're kind of. I get the point. Obviously, it was a tremendously painful time for America, and like we had to react. We had to retaliate.
I'm
But
saying it's not comparable. I'm not
It's
saying
a
that-
casualty
I'm
of
saying
war.
it's
Okay?
worse.
That-
1,000,000 people in a country that had nothing to do with what happened to us. 1,000,000 human beings. Like I think we're
It's-
forgetting the
what-
size of that number.
But I understand, and it is bad. I'm never going to say that our activity in the Middle East in the Obama and Bush administrations was good. But the problem is that the incentive is way different, and it's not a bad precedent that's to set that fighting against terrorism is a relatively good intention. Whether you do it well
I would
or not,
agree if
is
that was the precedent we set.
that
And
is
of
the
course it
precedent
has
we
to be
set.
done well. If you're going to
it does need to be done well.
take out
but
someone, it does have to. So this
I
precedent
agree.
we set is we can use unfathomable force
There's
poorly. But hey, because something happened to us, it's justified.
Do you think that is actually worse than invading a country because you want the land?
Tenfold.
Seriously, you
Tenfold.
think that using
Yeah,
too much?
it-
You think real quick? You think that using too much force to fight against terrorism is way worse than invading a smaller country because you want to take their land?
You're
Well,
not
ultimately,
bombing
let's
Iraq
look
was
at-
not fighting against terrorism. Let's just
Okay,
make
feels
I
that.
more
think we
that-
need to just draw a distinction here, because like the Ukrainian war is a modern war. It's a peer-to-peer war. It's much more bloody than anything that happened in Iraq or Afghanistan. Because
I would say the death toll on both sides in Ukraine, modern or not, is still lower than what we did in Iraq.
well, I say
could be
this
wrong.
because in every modern conflict, they're all any peer-to-peer conflict. There's going to be more casualties in general. I would argue.
This would be an exception. This was not peer to peer. Iraq was not peer to peer
Because
at all, and the casualties
Because you're
were way
taking advantage
higher.
of modern nation states. We know this from experience in World War II specifically.
I agree with that. I'm just saying, we're talking about precedent being set, and I think yes, fighting against terrorism is not a bad thing in the slightest. But
Is it
if you set the
imperialism?
precedent that hey, it's not even that. It's just might makes right. Hey, we
not just
got
might
hurt,
makes-
so we're gonna use.
It's not just might makes right. It's
Were there
literally,
any
like,
penalties?
what
Did we pay any
Russia-
sanctions? Did
what
we,
Russia is doing is
I mean-
literally imperialism.
I mean,
So
Bush ended up
that-
crushing
that's
the economy, so
difference.
there's that.
I mean, yeah, but that wasn't, a penalty. That was just his stupidity.
It was a
kind
side effect
causing-
of that war, though. You agreed? don't you?
Agreed.
Wouldn't you?
Yeah, 100%. I would. A repercussion that I think, but that correlation is not causation. Just because that happened doesn't mean that. We overall got away pretty scot-free on an international scale. Fucked our own economy up, caused a recession. Sure.
I would argue not really. No, I feel like no, because it made American people less interventionist. like after getting out of Iraq, it made the American people. We have like I call it Iraq syndrome, where we don't want to like invade any other countries at all anymore. That's why like Trump. That's why Trump is like very popular with these
Is that a bad
anti-war.
thing to not want to invade countries?
It
It's not a
depends.
bad thing, but it does open the door for bad actors to take advantage of that. I would argue.
Yeah, it
I would.
depends because it depends on how you're using it. It's good to be interventionalist generally, but when you're using the name of anti-interventionalism to end a war because a world superpower invaded a smaller country because they wanted the land, that's not interventionalist. Using that philosophy to side with Russia in this war is absolutely insane, and that's exactly what Donald Trump is using it for.
Yeah, and I agree that that necessarily is really not great now at this point when all of this has been done. I would have much rather that have been the stance from the beginning. I think a lot more Ukrainians and Russians and just human life would be saved. Which I hope we can all agree that regardless of where you're from, like human life is valuable. It's unfortunate no matter what where you're from if hundreds of thousands of people are dying. And I guess maybe that's kind of my angle is like I just whatever has to happen to preserve more life is kind of what I'm gonna
It's
default to.
okay. Think of it this way: it's about fighting for an ideal. Okay, like the United States was built like on fighting, sacrificing our lives to fight for an ideal, better like
Mm.
future for ourselves. And the Ukrainians are they have that same aspiration as us, back when we were founded, um, by declaring ourselves a self-governing nation, separate from Great Britain. They
Yeah.
have the same aspirations in many ways as our founders had. And I feel like that's aspirational.
It is.
I
It's
also
And
think
noble, but it's not our problem.
I think it's bad to
but it
frame. I think it's bad to frame it as well. I just want to see whatever causes the least life to be lost. Whenever Ukraine is literally willingly signing up for this war because they don't want their borders compromised, we are supporting the Ukrainian people because they wanted to keep fighting this war.
And they should have the ability to do so. But why do our, taxpayer dollars have to go to if they would actually
it,
if they had a
Well,
chance of winning, it would be a totally different argument. I'd say, yeah, let's help them
do
out.
you want to know the
From day one, I
realistic
was like,
answer? The
what was
realistic
that?
answer is because we vote Congress people in who support giving aid to Ukraine. If the American people didn't want to give aid to Ukraine, they should have voted in different Congress people. It's as simple
Yeah,
as
but
that.
there's election cycles and things a lot of times that
I mean,
people
we
who are
kind of
already in
did that
can
at this
get
point, though. We gotta
yeah, and
admit.
I would say exactly that's exactly what we've seen. The American people have resoundingly kind of spoken of
Well,
like,
no.
hey, we don't want to
To
do
be
this.
clear on this, like the American people voted on inflation at home specifically. They
I would
wanted to
agree.
punish the Democrats on this issue because we were bad at governing, not bad at governing. We were bad at messaging how our solutions in how we reduce inflation, and Trump took advantage of that. To be
Oh yeah,
clear,
he
Well,
just was we
I
gave
also
him the
the American
think
people
softball.
have much more
that
simplistic like reasons for why they voted for Trump in this past election
Yeah,
cycle. To
gas
be
is too
clear,
expensive. Let's bring him in. Oh shit, why are my eggs so expensive now?
I do think that the government needs to be doing more at home than it does need to be policing the world. And I think that's the point we're all trying to get at here. Regardless of what is happening during this conflict in Ukraine, Israel, and everywhere else in the world where United States is sending a large amount of funds, I would think it is more of an improvement, as we keep going back to, for United States to stop doing that, or at least
okay.
not let them fund the bill, or essentially be the main sponsor in all of this.
I would be
NATO does exist for a reason, and I do understand that Donald Trump has been against actually staying out of NATO, and I think it's more common for the West to figure out what the West has going on because we have a lot of problems because of these solutions we've been, I guess, invading other countries, killing a million Iraqis. It doesn't seem to work. I think maybe taking these funds and deciding
Wait,
this
can you
needs
speak
to
up?
go.
Can you speak up a little bit? Like, can you improve your headset? Can't really hear you.
Yeah, a little muffled.
Not the other person, the other dude.
Is this
Go right.
fine?
Nah, it's still a little muffled.
Can you not hear me?
Yeah,
What the heck?
We can hear you.
yeah,
It's
it's a
just
little muffled.
gotta
yeah, it's a little
focus.
quiet. Yeah.
Hold on.
It's that ASMR.
Is this better now?
Sorry. One more time.
Is this better? Do re mi si fa sol la.
Slightly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Alright,
maybe
slightly.
like 5% better.
Yeah,
I,
maybe
I
6 on a
I
good
did
day.
make my point. I'm just curious on what you guys would think about United States stop being so much of a policeman and then go back to the fact that United States has its own problems and we need to be putting that work
Uh,
here opposed to
I,
these other outside foreign entities
wait,
and funding proxy wars.
I think it falls back onto.
right.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, okay. I can acknowledge like the United States needs to focus in on at home, doing things at home, like doing infrastructure projects throughout the country itself. Like I
Don't
acknowledge that,
concede
but at the
that.
same time, I would
Don't
argue
concede
the United
that.
States has been and has done in the past chewed gum and walk at the same time.
That's okay.
We
Yeah.
could improve our infrastructure at home and focus it on projects that we do at home, focusing at home, passing legislation that benefits people in the United States at home, as well as helping our allies as well. Um,
Yeah,
like we did it.
I'd point out two things. Is that
How could we still be doing that if we removed a gold backing in early 1960s, if I'm correct, under Reagan? No, sorry, not Reagan.
80s, I think.
80s, and I believe it
It
actually might
was
have been
Reagan. I
earlier than
think it
the
was
80s.
Reagan, but
No,
I
but
believe it
it
was
wasn't
Nixon.
Reagan. It was Nixon. To be clear
It
about
was
that.
Nixon. Yeah,
I know.
okay.
I had to correct myself there. So it is Nixon.
Nixon,
We
72.
remove this gold backing, essentially
Yes.
giving our, I guess, what we won out of World War II as the biggest economic power at the time. We have fallen short on the political stage in the sense of this country is worth the most. It's the best in the world. We're not. We really aren't. And there's been countless cases, including the invasion of Iraq and Ukraine currently, that we're getting nowhere with being the world police anymore. And there needs to be more discussion with those other big superpowers to take the role of helping protect peace across the world. No one wants a nuclear annihilation.
do you think
And I would find it very hard to
I
believe.
agree that Europe should play a bigger role.
real
They
quick,
should like.
Europe should, but Europe isn't the question of who's going to fill that power vacuum. It falls back to this question again. Do we think that if Russia and China stepped up as world policemen, that they would honestly engage with that role? Because I
don't
honestly
think
feel
anyone
like
should be a world
absolutely
police.
not.
I think any overhead government
Then we're
that
living
tells any other country what to do and how to do it
we're living
is
in a utopia
is
at that
actually
point.
a horrible thing. I think the United States has built this beautiful experiment of a democracy that has somewhat gotten pretty far. I don't think we should consider ourselves the master of know all.
We're,
I don't think Russia would be on conquesting the West if we just stopped funding proxy wars. I don't think that at all.
I
would,
mean,
we're living
then
in
they should stop
we're living
funding
in a
proxy wars
utopia at
themselves.
that
To be
point.
clear,
We're living in a
that's
utopia at that
ideal,
point.
but like war is always going to happen. You know, there's always going to be a conflict somewhere in the world. Ultimately, what is the next level
This is
to what we currently live in? I mean, I don't know. Is it another World War III and
Maybe,
powers reset?
maybe,
No one
maybe I
knows
can
the
bridge the
future.
gap
well, real
here.
quick.
I just want to say one quick thing. I
Okay,
I would
go ahead.
like, and I think maybe you'd be surprised to hear this, Joe.
okay.
I would
After
actually
you,
love.
let Ren speak.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't hear it when I'm talking if someone else is speaking. So sorry if I cut you off.
You're okay.
Um. Oh, well, you go first because I lost my train of thought.
Sorry. I think it's easy to say that not a country shouldn't serve as the world's police, and in theory, I probably agree. But the problem is that we're living in a utopia at that point. This is just a fact of how countries interact with each other. We're living in a globalist world. There needs to be some sort of leader in that globalist world, and I don't trust China to be that leader. I don't trust Russia to be that leader. I think that our country is the best of the three world superpowers, so that's where our country is. I think saying anything else is probably going to just be leaning too far into utopianism, and at that point we should just say, okay,
To
well,
compare your
no
point
war
about
should happen ever.
to compare your point about Donald Trump being a very big authoritarian, that dialect you're speaking right now is authoritarian. It is very, we are here, we are the government, and we are the world's police. I don't think that's what anyone wants. You know, who wants to be overruled essentially?
Well, I think
To be their own.
authoritarianism is
Wait,
really
can I
more
take this
applied
point?
when it's
Wait,
internal.
Please. Can I respond to that, please?
Okay.
Okay, so
Yes, go
first of all, When I say Trump is an authoritarian, I mean he's an authoritarian in a way that does not contort with our American democracy. I'm not saying that all authority is bad, because sometimes authority is good. But to be clear, the reason that I don't see America as working as an authoritarian in the same way that I see China or Russia working as an authoritarian is because the U.S. is in the UN. The U.S. is in NATO. We are not just saying we are the world police, we are, the king of everything. We have almost every Western country and some Eastern countries also right by our side that do support America taking on this position, or at the very least don't support Russia or China taking over this position. We control everything in a much more ethical way than Russia or China would. That's the thing. And if that requires some authoritarianism, then that's probably the best case scenario, because the alternative is China and Russia being the world superpowers and being infinitely more authoritarian.
Sorry, remind me the last time Russia or China, when they were doing their thing, they just accidentally killed 1 million people. Or, I actually think we have a far worse track
Georgia,
record.
We've already hit this. Yeah, we've already hit this point.
Yeah,
The
but at least
Soviet
they,
Union
they were
literally
going.
did holocausts. Like, I don't know what we're.
Yeah,
or
the
did
Soviet Union is
genocides,
also not
so-
Russia, Yeah, and we nuked 2 towns in Japan. We've all got blood in our hands. Like, I'm sure if you ask the Japanese who's been worse for them, ultimately they'd probably say us. It's all a matter of perspective.
Do you think that a Japanese
what?
person? Do you think a Japanese person would rather have the U.S. be the world police or Russia?
Oh, America now, absolutely. But
then-
historically,
then-
who's caused
then-
more,
then-
wait,
more
wait,
devastation than
Ren,
America?
let me take this.
Well,
I
I
can
still
hamper
didn't
in
get
this
my
point.
earlier point. All right, go for it.
So the reason why Japan specifically chooses us over, say, China in this situation, there's bad blood between them and China already.
Oh, yeah.
Massacred, all that. But we had to look at like the post World War II, specifically under MacArthur and his reign, where we gave Japan the tools necessary to rebuild themselves through the U.S. occupation to become like their modern nation state and become like a democracy, and to cramp down, to destroy the previous monopoly system that was the Japanese Empire that controlled it.
Yep.
So
No, that's all true, but we should also all agree, like, based on Geneva Convention and everything, like, I'm not going to argue whether or not we should have dropped the nuclear bombs. I think there was a very good argument for why we had to, but according to standard, conventions, that was 100% a war crime. It was a world war of world.
I wouldn't necessarily call that necessarily a war
No.
crime.
I totally
Really?
disagree. It is 100% war crime. Unfortunately, that
it
was the
absolutely
standard
is,
of World
yeah.
War II. That was,
I-
we were up to our neck.
Ren, I
in
think I
war
talked to you about
crimes.
this, having a third position on this.
Well, that's on justification.
I can present like my
objectively is a
argument.
crime.
It sort of is. It's a little more nuanced than that.
It's collective punishment. You killed a huge amount of innocent
okay,
people.
okay.
It's
If we're
on
gonna go
paper,
down
at
this
least
road,
it is. Again, there's justification. I agree.
Okay, if we're gonna go down this road, just be prepared. Okay.
Oh God.
Okay, so I have a nuanced position on this, and it stems from the fact World War II was a very unique war. And what I mean unique war is that air power became very dominant in World War II. Specifically, the United States, from before the onset in this war, had a goal in mind, and that was strategic bombing in Europe. Strategic bombing was to hit like factories, not civilian targets. That wasn't the
This
initial
is all irrelevant.
like policy position the United States endorsed at first.
The justification
It's
is
through the
irrelevant.
course of
If
the
it was a
war,
war crime, it is a war
by
crime.
1942,
You could say that war
1943,
crimes may be
where we're losing
justified.
airmen,
It was a war
like,
crime. That's
100%.
it.
Like they're being killed. You're more likely to be killed in an aircraft than say on the ground.
Yep.
And what made strategic bombing impractical, and why we switched to carpet bombing, was the numerous of factors, mainly due to like the weather, anti-air, as well as the very like nature of the air war. Like the very nature of the air war depended more so on attacking depend on attacking, knocking out their air force, which then allowed the bombers to hit their strategic bombing. Now, how does this relate to the atomic bombings? Well, it's if you look through like 1944, was the Dresden like bombings happened. It's around the same time that LeMay started firebombing Japan. The United States at that point has already crossed that red line. Civilian targets are a military target at that point, which
I
then
agreed
leads.
at that point, but since then, the Geneva Convention has been introduced and all these things to prevent war crimes like that from being normalized. At the
Yeah,
very least, you may
but
need the second
I guess I
atomic
would
bomb is
argue more so the fire
unnecessary.
bombings themselves are more of a war crime than the atomic bombings themselves because we only used them like twice compared to like the
Well,
fire bombings.
I mean, at the
On
very least, let's say the
Well,
second one on Nagasaki was
I
more of like that one. I think was just like an
regardless,
unintentional,
right now,
unnecessary.
right now we're just talking about justifications for it. Whether something is or is not a war crime is fairly black and white. And this, like the two atomic bombings, may have been more justified than other bombings prior in World War II, but they were absolutely war crimes.
I agree. I agree. And
Think
unfortunately, that
yeah,
was the standard
I
of,
can't.
World
Ren,
War
sorry,
II.
that's like one area where I was sort of I can't really agree with you entirely.
Wait, like okay,
Okay.
I
so
mean, you can look up a war crime in the Geneva Convention and like its
I read.
definition
No,
of it.
I read like I I say this. I wouldn't call it like a war crime specifically because like both sides escalated in the air war that led to like the normalization of cities being bombed. We see
but
this like
To
in
the
normalization
normalization of war
normalization doesn't
crimes.
mean normalization of war crimes doesn't make it not a war crime.
Yeah, I think you're looking at it
I'm
too
not.
emotionally in terms of like, oh, there was a reason for it, we had to do it, and that's all true. But like, it doesn't change the fact it was still a war crime. Like, if you look up the definition of killing that many innocent people, black and white, it's a war crime.
Or
True
living
or
in
true,
cities war torn.
unfortunately.
It's. I would argue it's not really that black and white to be honest. I think it's more a little more nuanced than that.
How is it not
I
a
see your point,
I don't, but it's
but
okay.
Ren, I'll talk to you. I'll show
Yeah,
you.
we could
I'll
talk
link
another
you like
time.
a book on this. Like we can talk this about another time.
Yeah, that's fine.
what last thing I was gonna say is I think you'd be surprised to hear this. I would love for America to be the world's police. A couple things have to happen for that to be possible. Because I do believe we have a much higher ethical standard than virtually any other country. I think America is doing it better than any other country in the world, which is why I live here. And I think we're tremendously lucky to have such a good system.
Why
That
argue?
being said, we have a lot of bad apples.
Where has this?
When they have a lot of power, they can make some
Where
really
did
big
this go?
mistakes
Where did
or
this come
just do things
from?
that are evil. I don't know.
What?
So one, I think while we're not sure with people like Trump and Elon Musk and things in power like that, I think that's a kind of scary people type of person to have at the helm if we're going to be the world police force. And then two, it's kind of that thing like when you're in a plane and it's going to crash, they always say put the mask on yourself before you put it on your child. I think we have to be strong, fully strong, in order to actually be able to do this. I think it would have been, and this is controversial, I think it would have actually been great if Russia invaded and we just went straight into Russia, wreak some hell, scare the Kremlin. We don't have the power to do that because Russia's pretty close to us in that aspect. Actually, they have more nuclear warheads than we do. Um, so I think in order for us to be a police force, we have to do some work on ourselves first. If I want to get in an MMA fight, I got to go to the gym. I can't just hop in the cage. Um, so yeah, in theory, I do think America is better equipped. But I think if you look at our track record, most of our interventionism has actually resulted very poorly, both for the places we've intervened and for ourselves afterwards. Whether it's Ukraine or Afghanistan or Iraq or Yemen or Cuba, like you name it. Anytime we usually get involved somewhere, there's a hefty price tag, and I don't think enough people on this side of the Atlantic really notice that or are aware of the reason why so many other countries really don't like us. Like Egypt is a huge recipient of foreign aid from America. They rely on it a lot. And a lot of people here are like, oh, it's because we help the Egyptians. No, they don't help us at all. It all gets pocketed by the oligarchs, and the real people at the bottom don't get anything. And then they see these bombs and they see that, and it creates such a hatred for America that's very, very bad for us because we're doing this like in a half-assed manner. I don't actually think we're achieving what we think we are. A lot of people are just padding their wallets, and we're doing it under the guise of like, oh well, Russia bad, America good. That can be the case, and we can also still say, yeah, but this isn't our fight. We got our own fight right now. We got to figure out. I guess that's more of my like core of the thing. I don't disagree with the reasons we've done any of this. I just think the timing and the manner in which it has been executed has been mediocre at best. Um, I, that's just my take on it. And I really do actually appreciate some of the things you guys said. Like, it gave me some things to think about. Joe knows me pretty well. If someone else was arguing like, oh, Putin's, justified doing this, I would probably be hitting them with all of your talking points. I like being devil's advocate.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, no, I think ideally we should aspire to be the police force of the world. We're just so unbelievably unprepared right now.
Yeah,
I
and you know what, guys?
Sorry, go
I
ahead.
actually got to head off of this thing. I'm getting ready to read the book and head off to sleep. But you've all given me things to think about. Antara and I
Yeah.
talk.
Yeah, before you
baseball all the
leave,
time, so
you guys mind like following me like on this account? Me and
yeah,
Ren
I'll
are
give you a
probably
follow.
gonna do
I
this more
already
often.
followed you both.
Yeah, this was
Definitely
great.
follow me back. And then if you guys want to do another space, we should definitely do one. I have a big TikTok account, Joe.stills, if you guys want to check it out on TikTok.
Yeah, for sure.
I can potentially even use some of the group chats and connections I have through Discord to potentially get some other people in here and debate. It might be interesting
Yeah,
for
100%. We're
a lot
looking
of people.
for content.
Hey, listen.
Yeah, I just want to apologize if I got a little heated
No, it's okay.
at any point there.
We
No,
all
and
we
you
all
know
get
what?
heated. It happens.
Listen, you guys have beautiful debate skill and etiquette as well. I like the times Sage jumped in there and kind of leveled the conversation, and Rinyald, you have some good points as well, and I appreciate the civil manner of which you both conducted yourselves. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate you you joining in. And I'm sure I also speak for Sage in that. Listen, if you guys ever wanna, my main thing is debating January 6th. So if you ever want to talk about that, that's
Yeah.
I never talk
Yeah,
about
no,
foreign
that-
policy.
Oh, man, foreign policy is my cup of tea. Domestic, I'm a moron. I'm terrible.
Well, listen, I'd love
Um,
even if it's not a debate, I'd love to open your guys' mind a little bit.
Yeah, I'd like to learn. I was going to say that. Like, I don't know very much about January 6th. The
I'm
main
a
talking
history
points.
nerd, by the way, so you can
I
probably
could
tell by
tell.
this conversation.
I could tell. Sage was going into. I actually love planes, and the whole reason World War II got so crazy was because of air warfare. And it's
Oh, yeah.
insane to me that dogfights once happened, and I wasn't alive for it.
Yeah, I think it's surprisingly one interesting fact I learned by studying the air war is that it's much more nuanced than what Star Wars has presented it as.
It's too funny.
I know
All
what
right.
you
Well,
mean, though.
listen. I appreciate you both. Antara, you could stay on here as well. I just got to head out here, and
I've had a
maybe
friend
we should
call
do
me
another
6
debate soon.
times
I'd
and
love to
try
hear
to
more
get to
about
me.
January. The incursion, so what some Americans call it. But
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, man.
Insurrection.
Insurrection. But definitely we'll have to hop on another space soon. This was very good.
Yeah, for sure.
I just gotta ask, what kind of demographic you guys? And you guys on the younger end? You guys pretty older? You guys
I'm
just like through high
23.
school? Or?
I don't know what
21.
Ren is.
I'm 21.
21. Gotcha. I'm 23, so it's interesting to
Base, we're
actually
same
hear.
age.
Yeah,
Damn,
it's
I'm the
interesting to
old
hear
guy. I'm 30.
this perspective from people my age, because right where I live in Antara, where we're from in Mass, there's not a lot of young folks talking about this stuff, especially in Twitter debates. So appreciate all the conversing we've been going back and forth with.
Yeah, for sure.
Very much so.
Yeah, I appreciate
Awesome, guys.
you,
Well, I got to head
calling.
out, too, so this is a great talk. I followed you guys if you want to do the same, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, for sure.
You too.
See you guys. Good talk.
All right. Wow. W. Good.
Okay, so
Good chat.